Hello, my name is Ben Hovland, and I'm a commissioner with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. As the Federal Clearinghouse on Election Administration, the EAC is working to provide information and resources for election officials and offering whatever support we can at the federal level to help state and local officials administer safe, secure, accessible, and accurate elections. Today's video chat is the second in a series focused on administering elections in college towns and identifying better ways to serve the student populations. We know that voting is habit forming and it's critical to engage young voters and ensure they have a positive experience. We also know that anytime Americans move, there's an increased chance they could run into an administrative hurdle that could potentially keep them from voting. Helping Americans navigate these challenges to ensure their registration is up to date helps ensure everyone has a great trip to the polling place or gets their mail ballot delivered to the correct address. Fortunately, today we're joined by an amazing group to discuss this topic. Joining me today in alphabetical order by first name are Clarissa Unger, who is the co-founder and executive director of Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, the largest nonpartisan network in the United States dedicated to increasing student voter participation. Prior to founding the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, she served as the development coordinator for the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas, where she helped to promote civic and democratic engagement on campus. We're also joined by Jennifer Domagal-Goldman, who's the executive director of the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge at Civic Nation. Prior to joining the challenge, she directed the American Democracy Project, a national civic learning and democratic engagement network of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. We also have Marissa Corrente, who currently serves as the District of Columbia Board of Elections Registrar of Voters. She brings a unique perspective to student voting space, having previously worked at Rollins College in Central Florida, coordinating campus-wide student voter engagement efforts, as well as previously at the Orange County, Florida Supervisor of Elections, where she managed early voting for the county there, and also is a former Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition staffer. And finally, Yael Bromberg is a constitutional rights attorney and leading legal scholar and practitioner of the 26th Amendment. She teaches election law and the political process at Rutgers Law School, and previously served as special counsel to the Andrew Goodman Foundation, a national youth voting organization for 80 campuses across 25 states. So you can see we've got a great group to discuss this topic today, and I'm really excited about it, but really just want to jump into things and probably start off. We'll go in the order introduction, but would really just love to give you all a chance to talk a little bit more about your work and/or your organization, just for familiarity with anyone who doesn't know about the great work that you've been doing. Clarissa, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And Commissioner Hovland, thank you again so much for having us here today for this conversation. I'm very excited to be with you all for this. As you mentioned, the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition is the largest nonpartisan network in the country, working to support local leaders and other nonprofit partners who are interested in engaging students in the voting process. So as a coalition, we convene and support local leaders from all across the country in those efforts, whether that be providing them connections, strategic ideas, resources, and funding while available. We also work to co-develop resources with local leaders across the country and with our partners, and to also minimize duplication across the field. So that's in a nutshell what we do at the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition.
Great, thank you. Jen?
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for having us today. It's delightful to be with this group. As you indicated previously, I lead an organization called the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge. We are proud to be one of the founding members of the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, and to be having been doing this work since 2016. All-In, as we call ourselves, is a national nonpartisan effort that works with more than 960 colleges and universities across all 50 states and the District of Columbia, where Marissa is. We do the work to help campuses create cultures of what we call nonpartisan democratic engagement, which really focuses on civic learning, political engagement, and voter participation from registration to education and turnout. We're working alongside those campuses to help them create data-informed action plans, to work with a coalition of stakeholders on and off campus, including local nonpartisan groups, and also the local boards of elections and folks like Marissa. And we're helping to hopefully create or at least close gaps that persist based on age and race across the voting space. So we're really excited to be here and talk with you all today.
Great, thank you. Marissa, again, as I highlighted in your bio, you've got, I think most people who will watch this probably know what the DC Board of Elections does. With our audience is primarily election officials, but would really just love to hear about a little bit more about the work of your career and how you see these two spaces complementing each other, or if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited for the opportunity. I have approached this work from several different perspectives, which is unique in the space, I think. So I started my career in this kind of civic engagement space, student engagement space at Rollins College, as you mentioned. And that was really about helping lead our campus civic engagement efforts. And that was right at the start of the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition. All In was a huge part of our journey on campus, developing that work, getting students not just registered, but turning out to vote as well, and thinking more holistically about the democratic process, building their identities as voters. And so also, we had really strong relationships with our local board of elections while I was doing that work. And so I ended up transitioning out of Rollins and going to the Orange County Supervisor of Elections office under the leadership of Bill Cowles, who I know a lot of people will know in this space, the audience space. So I worked on early voting while I was there, and I helped manage those efforts during the 2018 election. And then I got drawn back into the student voting space and ended up in DC working with the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition as the deputy director, and did that work and census work all through 2020. And then I felt called back to the election administration space. And so I've been with the DC Board of Elections now as the Registrar of Voters since the beginning of 2022. So I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. And I think the different perspectives that I've done this work through and directly, hopefully will provide some insight to our audience members.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. And then Yael Bromberg, welcome. And if you could tell us a little bit more about your work.
Sure. Well, thank you. And it's good to be with all of you this morning. Such strong women in the space, really kind of creating structural change and also direct impact. So my name is Yael Bromberg. As Commissioner Hovland mentioned, I'm a constitutional rights attorney. I come to this work having been a student organizer myself 20 years ago, and had always been the one that was working with the attorneys somehow. I think it's my immigrant identity. Somehow I wanted the translation of the language. And I found myself pursuing law school alongside the social justice movements that I had already been very much a part of. And I found myself, not surprisingly, pursuing constitutional rights and constitutional litigation. And I was teaching constitutional law at Georgetown Law, and I realized that there's not a lot of discussion around the 26th Amendment at all. It's not in the constitutional text. No one knows what it is. And so, I had the benefit of being able to go down to the Library of Congress and doing a lot of research in the archives around this unappreciated, untapped potential well of justice, and started developing legal scholarship around it, bringing in other diverse voices in the field, such as Commissioner Hovland, whose piece was also published in the first legal volume on the 26th Amendment, and also litigating around this issue across the country and training young people to be watchdogs for the violation of this right. So I practice in a range of constitutional rights issues through my firm, representing a range of youth led organizations in the country, in addition to teaching election law and the political process at Rutgers Law School.
Great, thank you. Well, as you all can see, we've got a great group here to talk about this. And actually this time we'll go in reverse order. Yael, you hit on some of probably the further end of the spectrum and the legal challenges that most people watching this hope they don't find themselves in. But we do know, as I alluded to in the introduction, student voters face a number of challenges. There are certainly different deciding where they want to vote at their parents' residence or their school residence, but then also just the impact of moving and being unfamiliar with the process. And so, I'd like to just talk a little bit about, for everyone to talk about sort of what you see as some of the unique challenges that student voters face and sort of the long-term impact of helping to reduce those barriers. And Yael, if you want to start us off on this one.
Sure. So it's really from soup to nuts. And what the 26th Amendment provides is a unique framework to understand that a discrete class and protected constitutional class was created through ratification of the 26th Amendment. One of the things that I found really interesting in the democracy space is there is an appreciation and acknowledgement, because we know so much about the value of the 14th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, even the 24th Amendment to invalidate the poll tax, but no one really knows what the 26th Amendment is. And there's a lot of power in recognizing that it establishes a constitutional right to protect a discrete class, just like race and gender are protected. Age-based access to the ballot, free of discrimination, is similarly protected. And when you just drill down a little bit on the data, you find an incredible way in which young people are uniquely targeted intentionally or disproportionately impacted through effect. And one of the key statistics that I always refer to that just, I think there's so many stats out there, but that just illustrates this, is that provisional ballots. If you look at the provisional ballots, of course, provisional ballots are a safeguard to ensuring that somebody who's not on the books, despite their best efforts on the voter rolls when they show up, or they can't submit the required proofs, they can vote provisionally as a stopgap, as a potential safety measure, as a safe harbor. But if you look at the reliance on provisional ballots, 1 in 4 millennials polled in the 2016 race had to vote provisionally. That means that whatever they did in advance failed, and they were given a provisional ballot. When you compare that to boomers, 6%, and members of the greatest generation, 3%. So these are huge figures. And when you look at the rejection rates of those provisional ballots, you similarly find disproportional rejections. And when you divide it back based on geography, such as the counties which are hosts to colleges, you find geographic disparities, and you find racial disparities based on race and age. So it's really a soup to nuts issue with regard to youth access. We have to start with pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds to teach them how to go through this process. Most successful measures are when the county clerks actually come into the high schools to assist in that endeavor, and then ensure that they have voter mobility when they go to college or when they just move. They don't even necessarily need to go to college, right? But they're a highly mobile population, as the commissioner just mentioned. And so we have to make sure that all of the measures in place continue to protect them. That means also unfettered access to vote by mail. 70% of young people voted by mail in the 2020 election. However, 7 states in the nation outright do not allow young people to vote by mail free of an excuse. And we have other safety measures, such as what's very popular in Washington, D.C., because it has such a highly mobile population, is Election Day registration, which works seamlessly there. You just show up and you can vote, right? You prove you say who you are and that you vote, that you live where you say that you live, and you can vote. In Wisconsin, there's a challenge around and endless challenges in New Hampshire around the ability for young people to vote from their college address. Even though the Supreme Court even though the Supreme Court in 1979 affirmed the right for students to vote from their college addresses, however many years later, we are still pushing for that fight. And Clarissa can speak to that very clearly, and Jen can as well, with regard to the need for young people to continue to assert that right and the colleges to prove it on their behalf. And there's a range of other issues with regard to access to student voter identification as qualified ID, the protection of vote by mail ballots, which are disproportionately rejected when they're cast by young people. So we really have our work cut out for ourselves. But for me, I'm really excited about this youth base and these youth-led efforts, because there's just no shortage of both inspiration and opportunity in this field. And again, I just want to call in all of these phenomenal women leaders that are really kind of doing the work in the field to continue to protect and expand the right, so that young people are not repeatedly disproportionately voting at low rates compared to the other age cohorts.
Thank you for that. And actually, you teed up a little twist on it, and Marissa, coming to you next on this. But again, particularly with your perspective as someone who's worked in the student advocacy space and as an election official, you know, when I think about some of those things, you know, the provisional ballot issue, you know, or just, you know, it's always harder on poll workers when people show up and their information isn't correct. You know, there is a provisional ballot issue or just frankly telling people they're not registered in that jurisdiction. And so obviously for election officials, there's an incentive to try to get those folks figured out, but a big piece of that is voter education. And so, you know, again, back to the original question, I guess, on what are some of those challenges from your vantage point and sort of how we can reduce that and how that helps in the long term.
Thank you. That's a great question. So obviously the election laws can have a huge impact, right? Just as we were discussing. I think the other piece of it is that we're a decentralized model. And so that each state has different election laws. So my own personal story is I grew up in a state, went to school at another state, formed my voter identity there, and then I moved down to Florida after I graduated. And I wanted to vote in my first primary, and I declared myself as an independent because I wanted to not be affiliated with any party. But then in Florida, there's a closed primary system, which is a very normal part of the process, but I didn't have that in the state where I came from. So I wasn't thinking about that. And by the time that I realized I needed to declare a party, I had missed the deadline. So again, like this is somebody, I was an active voter, I was interested, I still missed a lot of the messaging around it. And I missed participating in that election. Didn't happen again, never happened again. But so I think that's another piece of it. There's laws that are different across each state, even within counties sometimes, right? In the local jurisdictions, processes can be a little different. And so that is difficult to navigate when you're just coming of age in order to be able to vote, right? You have a lot of other things on your plate that are important: work, school, family, there's a lot going on. And so I think that piece of it is also, creates challenges that are important for election officials to be thinking through and how they're reaching students. Because exactly to your point, if we can get ahead of that messaging and make sure that they're prepared, it cuts out on a lot of problems on the back end. And that's why colleges and universities are such an integral part of the process, because they have an active audience in these students and they're trusted voices. So the students already know them, whereas maybe as the election official, even though we are also trusted voices for this work, obviously, but we can work in partnership together to make sure the students are getting the correct messaging so that they can register and turn out to vote.
Great, thank you. Jen, is there anything you'd add on that?
I have to unmute myself there. This is a great conversation, Commissioner Hovland, and I really appreciate the insights, both from Yael, who has been just doing fantastic work that has helped set the stage for so much of the work the rest of us have been doing, and from Marissa's kind of various perspectives. And one of the stories I always say when I talk to folks on the campuses that we work with, and by folks, I really, in this case, mean a lot of the faculty and administrators who in many cases have been at that same school and in that same space for a while and have a sense of how to vote there, but don't have a sense of the broader piece of that, how it's decentralized and it changes, right? And I went to school a few years even earlier than Yael did for college, but when I was a freshman, I was deeply interested. It was going to be my first election. It was a presidential election. I knew who I wanted to vote for. I was pretty intrigued. And if it wasn't for my mom sending me my absentee ballot request form at that point, because I was going to school about 3 hours down the road from where I grew up, and I had already registered in my participation in government class my senior year, I would have missed the deadline because I was so busy trying to get along with my roommate, trying to pass calculus as somebody who eventually majored in English, that I just would have missed it, right? And it wasn't, I'm sure there was lots of messaging going on, but it wasn't hitting me. This was also in like the before times of like cell phones and social media. So, there's pieces of it that definitely date me here. But I think I was one of the people who wanted to be paying attention, who had registered, who had the right ID, who did all those things. And I would have missed it if it wasn't for the fact that I had a really engaged parent who had always brought me to the polls and those kinds of things, and I would have missed it. And that's part of the story of these students, right? And, when we talk about trying to close some of these gaps, right? Like once they've been there longer and they become seniors or graduate students and things like that, they're voting at higher levels once they've kind of figured it out. But they also, even if they're on campus and they're voting there, they move more often, or they don't check their mail as much because we do so many things by email and online, right? And so, there are all these kind of barriers that aren't even the legal barriers and the intentional barriers. And so I agree, election officials are really trusted messengers if we can get their message to the students, and their institutions are really trusted messengers who don't always realize when the students need the right information at the right times, particularly if they have students from a variety of places, right? From across the state or from out of state, and to help them make those choices, right? And so I think, the work in the space and the relationship with local election officials to people like you're seeing on this video, and to the folks doing this work and to the folks on campuses is just critically important.
Those are great points. Thank you. Clarissa, anything you'd add? I know we've hit a lot, but no.
Yeah, we have hit a lot. Everyone's shared a lot of great information. I think one thing that's really important to remember when we do talk about challenges that students and young people face to voting is that they're really first-time voters. And I think that framing is also really helpful in thinking about how to approach student voter engagement and youth voter engagement in ways that are helpful to them. Because we know that in addition to a lot of the logistical barriers that they face, they also, as first-time voters, face a lot of psychological barriers as well. So for example, we have done some work with a partner in the coalition, Ideas 42, which is a behavioral science firm that has found some really helpful information that shows that students and first-time voters can really both overestimate the difficulty of voting, which we know is easier in some places than others, but they can also underestimate their own ability to navigate the candidates and the issues on their ballot. So these are just a couple more reasons why, as we've been talking about a little bit, and I know we'll get into more, that voter education piece also is incredibly important.
Thank you. Yeah, I've seen a lot of that social science about sort of that intimidation factor, and I know sort of one of the highlights for me of having worked in this space and been a poll worker is handing that I voted sticker to that 18-year-old on the first time, and kind of seeing that excitement that they've successfully participated in. It wasn't as hard as they thought it was going to be, and that's just that positive experience will resonate, and so just sort of building off of that and some of what we were talking about. Jen, I'll go to you first because you kind of hit on this a little bit, but thinking about your work and the value of sort of partnerships, is there anything that you would highlight, sort of examples that you've seen where local election officials have effectively worked with colleges or universities or groups like yours to help engage student voters or help people participate in the process?
That's a really great question. And, the answer is, of course, there's tons of these examples across the country. Marissa, will be a prime example of telling the story in more than one place. And, as someone myself who's worked at a poll worker in more states than I might be able to count at the moment, I think it's some of that is really important. And I think pieces of some of the examples, and I'm not going to call out names of specific campuses right now, but pieces of it are, being in kind of communication ahead of time and knowing that you might end up with these too many folks on provisional ballots. So is there a way to work with the campuses in some states to make sure they have, a bill for that shows, zero balance and shows where they live that they might be able to use? Are you working to see if your student, from the campus end and the election official end, do the student IDs count as voter ID? Are you making sure that that's clear or not clear, right? Are you working to see and message where the polling place is going to be? And campuses are a great place to have polling places, not just for students, but for the community in many cases, right? They often have parking lots that can be clear. They're often very ADA accessible. They're often in central places. And so I think having those conversations can be really important. So I think, and then, the education place, and not just the education place for the students, but being able to have a candidate forum in the auditorium on campus that can be for the general public, which can be helpful for the education of students. So we've seen lots of these cases, and we also know that the places that are most successful have those open lines of communication and are, paying attention sooner. There's also a lot of folks doing education work or doing research or the ability to get more poll workers. So it should be really a mutually beneficial relationship. And so the hope is then, that they're kind of the students and the campus are being knit into that broader community and can be really a part of that really important relationship.
Thank you for that. And just to clarify a little too, definitely one of the things we see across the elections community, of course, is people taking advantage of the 50 states and the differences and seeing what their colleagues are doing and trying to tweak it in their own way. And so, we're trying to generate some ideas that other people have done and help people not reinvent the wheel in this area. And so, I think those were some great examples. And Clarissa, if you have others that you'd like to share, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll specifically call out some communities. So one example we point to a lot is the election officials in Madison, Wisconsin, working with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They do not have the ability to use the regular student IDs as voter IDs in Wisconsin, but the election officials there do work with the university to create specific IDs for students that need them that can be used as voter IDs. And that is a partnership that came about as a part of the election officials there being a part of their on-campus coalition. Also, we've seen in Rhode Island, some election officials, am I going to steal yours, Marissa? Marissa's from Rhode Island. Election officials who have worked with the campus to ensure that students that live there are residential students have one centralized address that they use for their voting address. Otherwise, their campus is split between different precincts, which is what we see in a lot of campuses. There are likely hundreds of campuses that are split by precincts, which makes it really confusing for students. But local election officials who are willing to work with those campuses to ensure that students have one centralized address that they use to register to vote can be incredibly helpful. We've also, as Jen mentioned, seen election officials work directly with campuses. One example is Georgia State University, working with them to have a fully staffed student on-campus polling location as well. And that's something that we're starting to see more across the country. So those are just a few examples of incredible partnerships that we've seen between campuses and election officials.
That's great. And Marissa, I will come to you and just as an added bonus that your story highlights for those folks who are looking to recruit added talent to their office, obviously engaging with folks may encourage them to explore a career in election administration.
Yeah, that's right. We actually just had a bunch of summer interns here in our office this summer, high school and college. And, a lot of people don't even realize that this is a career, right? They don't know that all that goes in behind the scenes. We are lucky, we are very fortunate here in DC that we actually don't have an election this year, which gives us time to prep for next year. Not every jurisdiction, most jurisdictions are not like that. And so I think the students came in thinking like, this election is so far away. What are we going to be doing? And then they learned a lot about the process, and we actually have kept some of them on because they're college students who go to school in the area. So that's been a great opportunity. I will also, you kind of plugged it already, but the other conversation you had with colleagues from the election administration field, they're doing incredible work, and that was a really rich conversation. So I would also invite people to make sure that they check that out. Because this was not even a plan. You didn't tell me to do
that. Was
this.
not a solicited promo. So check out the election officials video on this topic.
But yeah, it was, I really enjoyed listening to it because, we see work happening right across the country, but, there's even stuff that's happening that maybe isn't on our radar. And so it was a really rich conversation. I think one of the big things too is that a lot of schools are moving, a lot of campuses are moving towards these committees or coalitions on their campus themselves. And so there may be a part of a broader coalition, whether it's across the state or nationally, but they're pulling people in from different departments, students, faculty, staff. And if election officials have the capacity, it's really great to sit on that as well, or have somebody from your team sit on that, because that is a really impactful way to keep those lines of communication open. Because it is maybe, it can be harder for election officials who maybe don't have capacity to kind of designate somebody just to be the touch point for colleges, but it can be something that gets layered in to the work that other folks are doing.
That's great. And Yael, is there anything you'd add to this?
Well, I think that kind of the main points have been hit here. I was similarly going to call out Madison, Wisconsin as a good example of how election officials can proactively work on the local level. And the other piece that I'll just add is, the power of having the university administrative leaders supporting and proactively reaching out to the boards of elections as well is so powerful and critical, because once they do the outreach, a BOE that might be open to the engagement, but not necessarily proactive around it, is now hearing from high-level local officials about how to, proactively coordinate, and also not to take for granted the fact that the nature of the boards of elections actually rotate and they change. They're not always, stagnant entities, and the leadership within the BOEs change. So the great example offered around Fulton County and Georgia State University, they secured an on-campus polling location. Evan Marlborough is a mentee and constant collaborator with me. He led that initiative. And after having secured the on-campus polling location, they made sure that it was completely operated by students, engaging their peers in the process. And in the midst of COVID, they broadened that out to do a statewide youth poll worker program that recruited young people to serve in this critical need. There's actually a gap in poll workers, and young people can serve that for a range of reasons, including the fact that they tend to be bi or multilingual, increasingly also as the demographic is going to change. They'll be increasingly multilingual as well. But going back to my prior point is, even after having done all of that work, that Fulton County on-campus polling location was actually threatened last summer for a rollback, as well as other on-campus polling locations. And it was the student advocates that had to continue to kind of lean in. And similarly with the leadership at Bard College, those university administrators had been so critical in productively engaging their boards of election and creating examples that are so powerful, even statewide, that it motivated a recent change in New York law to mandate on-campus polling locations across the state. Unfortunately, in that example, it was following repeated litigation that we had to bring to hold them accountable, but it was the college administrators that were really watchdogging the ability, with the support of the students, of course, and the leadership of the students. But that was a critical aspect, and really generated goodwill also with regard to boards of education, other election administrators, locally and statewide.
Thank you for that. Marissa, you hit on something that I wanted to go to. So I'll come to you first on this one. Just wanted to talk about any advice that you might have for other local election officials, who want to help college students participate, but are obviously dealing with or likely dealing with limited resources for outreach and education.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a reality for so many folks who are doing this work. I think, like I said, the biggest thing is relying on the staff and faculty, or if there are student leaders who are doing the work on the college campuses, finding those folks who are interested and engaging in the work on their campus is important, because then it's a partnership. It doesn't all fall on you as the elections official. I really liked, I think it was Boone County in the other video, who talked about utilizing essentially service learning courses, is what it sounded like, where they used a business class to create a marketing plan for them. Was that Boone County? Is that correct? Yeah. And I don't even know if they ended up using the full marketing plan, but it really helped them actually look at their website and reassess their website. So again, even if maybe that campus doesn't have like a natural touch point of contact for the work, I think there are other ways to engage the campus maybe until they get to that point as well. So like service learning courses are a great way to enter a college campus and kind of help with that. And I think one of the other benefits from that partnership was, the students know what kind of, whether it's social, I don't even know what social media is popular, because I've been out of this area for a little bit with the students. So but the students will know, obviously. So if you can utilize, instead of us like guessing and thinking like they're on this, no, they're probably on something I have never even heard of. So I think that's important too, is going right to the source to get their feedback. So you can create plans and implement things. I think the other thing that, I think back to when I was especially when I was at the Orange County, Florida Board of Elections office, or Supervisor of Elections office rather, I coordinated early voting. So I wasn't an outreach person by any means, but when we started thinking about early voting sites and partnerships, we layered that into what I was doing and thinking about how can we engage the college campuses. So I think the other piece of it is you can maybe, and I know everyone's wearing a lot of hats and doing a lot of work, but you can kind of layer it into positions that are already happening. If you don't have kind of that one, or resources are limited for outreach and education.
Thank you for that. Clarissa, anything you'd add on, I guess, communications on a shoestring, or just how else people can think about sort of partnerships or figuring out ways to do some more communication outreach with the limited resource challenges?
Yeah, well, of course, like we've been talking about, it would be great if someone from an election office could join the on-campus coalition that the campus in their community may have. We know that's likely not always feasible. So even just having a point of contact designated for that campus coalition can be incredibly helpful. Also, I'll just mention we have seen some election offices that have created specific websites on their web pages on their websites that give information specific to students. That's been incredibly helpful too, but again, that's not totally feasible for everyone, but can be one of those good projects that you do in coordination with the campus. But I would say one of my biggest pieces of advice is just that investing time in reducing some of those administrative burdens for student voters will pay dividends in the long run. So again, when a local election official works with a campus to clear up questions about like what the dorm voting process should look like, that will just prevent so much work come election season. And as we were talking about, really reduce on some of those provisional ballot issues. So really just kind of thinking ahead about some of those potential administrative burden issues, I think can be incredibly helpful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, it takes time and costs money to process those things. And so, talking about it from a budgetary standpoint, it can be an investment as well. So great flag there. Jen, anything you would want to add to that?
I think this is just such a robust conversation. I think I want to pull on a couple of the things Marissa said, which are, not only, sometimes there's a lot of being short-staffed. Sometimes that work can feel the same way on a campus in this particular space. But, thinking about the fact that students could serve as interns, and that sometimes there are even if there's not money to pay the interns, sometimes the campus has money to pay interns who are doing public service kind of positions or community-based internship positions, right? That there are chances to have it embedded into coursework for students that could be beneficial. There's been a huge push across, from our organizations and elsewhere to really encourage more college students to serve as poll workers. So, even thinking about tapping that as a new, increased source of folks who can help with that. But also as you're doing that, thinking about any flexibility you have and not requiring them to do it from 6 a.m. till 9 p.m., but being able to break into smaller shifts, which really helps all poll workers. But I think it is what Clarissa is saying, like even just having a point person that can be designated and figuring out who the point person on campus should be. And I think one of the things I find that at least some of the local election officials I talk to don't know is that higher ed institutions are actually required by federal law to make a good faith effort to help college students register to vote. And so I think kind of realizing like this is part of the work they're supposed to be doing. And, and it's not just locally, it's helping them register in whatever ways the student decides, right? If it's their permanent address or school address, those kinds of things. But realizing this is something they're supposed to be doing, which is part of, our job, but being able to say, and reach out and say, hey, looking for somebody to be in contact with, and being able to say, you should have someone who is thinking about this work can also be really helpful. And I think, as we can decrease kind of, or increase understanding of kind of the different things that these two different populations have to think about in terms of what the local election officials need to think about, what the campuses need to think about, I think we can create these really nice collaborations that can really be mutually beneficial.
Thank you for that. Yael, I will come to you with that one on thinking about sort of communicating on a budget, but also add a little bit to it as well. Just if there are anything, I know this isn't necessarily your bailiwick, but things you've maybe seen as far as methods of communicating or voter education materials for young voters that have been particularly effective as well.
So I think addressing the budget question is leveraging the resources at the institution of higher education, including with what Marissa has demonstrated. She had student interns that she's going to continue to engage with, is a wonderful opportunity. It's also a provision that was included in the Youth Voting Rights Act to secure funding for those fellows, to really have them be placed within the boards of election, and similarly to put the on-campus polling locations, drop boxes on campus for those voting by mail, and making sure that those burdens, such as the voter burdens, as demonstrated by the rejection of provisional ballots and the rejection of vote by mail ballots, are met ahead of time. I thought that was a really great point that was raised earlier, because it does reduce the processing burden on the administrators' end. And all of that similarly relates to the question around communication. I found that texting is really successful with the students. including in the states where you can do vote by mail, chase and cure opportunities is key, because a lot of young people, they don't realize that they have the ability, for example, if they vote provisionally, to come back and they have more work to do to make sure that their provisional ballot is counted. And similarly, with regard to the rejection of vote by mail ballots, when you have an opportunity to go and to cure it, in some states even using electronic, technology, secure electronic technology, which is a different conversation. But I found that the texting is really helpful, because we get text messages for a range of issues. There's no reason why we can't use the most common. I mean, social media is good, and et cetera, direct email is good, but the texting, I find, and I think some of the statistics show actually, is the most direct and individualized form. And we also want to encourage the students, or just voters in general, that when we're filling out the voter registration form, they have a slot where they can put their cell phone number, they have a slot where they can put their email address. And those are, I don't always see the county boards of elections, for example, or, whatever the vernacular proper nomenclature is in the state, talk about decentralization. I don't know what to call them sometimes. I don't always see them using, especially the text messaging piece. So I think that that's a really good way to do individualized outreach and ensure that the rejected provisional ballots and vote by mail ballots are cured, as well as other voter education material. And going to the other point earlier is, sometimes the websites on the county level can be really helpful, but also the secretaries of states. Some of those secretary of state websites are very robust, and they have pages dedicated to youth voters, including by college community and location. And sometimes you see a very thin material, or maybe even none, and it just fosters more confusion. And so as a voting rights advocate, it's always really helpful to be able to look at the rules and regulations being promulgated and the notices being promulgated on the local, county, and state level to try to, clear up any potential voter confusion as well.
Thank you. Jen, actually, I'll come back to you on the one about sort of any methods of communicating with young voters that you seem to be particularly effective.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think some really good points have been made. I think, some of it's about trusted messengers that we've definitely talked about that today, and that, but it's also about the access to it, right? So I think some of the great news is if there are websites like that, or other, great information that's coming from the Secretary of States or the local election officials, if that gets shared with the campus in a way that lets them share it out, they have the methods of communicating with the students directly. So they often have text message platforms. They have platforms that have the course, the online course management systems where they can put a bulletin out and say, hey, the deadline for this is coming up, and here's the link to the local Board of Elections or the Secretary of State's website, or whatever that might be, right? They have, all of those different ways. They have huge communication teams often who can get materials that you provide them up on social media, or who might be able to take the information and create their own graphics, right? And I think that can be really important. And then I think the other piece is, is this like peer-to-peer piece. So like once you get the information out, like we often create a lot of graphics and things like that we share with campuses that use the information or re-up information from Secretary of State sites and things like that. And we give them to them in a toolkit, hoping that then that gets shared out and that the students are sharing it themselves. So we, getting, being able to kind of pick the brain of a student intern, or to figure out, what kind of graphic you make or who you should be sharing it with on the campus can be really helpful to get, again, all of that information out. A lot of campuses also have, some of the big publics have like local radio stations or, NPR affiliates or TV stations affiliated with them, and can often get the information broadcast out in even a bigger way to the community. And so I think, realizing kind of the way that these campuses are often integrated into the community can be really helpful in that sense too.
That's great. Clarissa, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I will take this opportunity to give a plug for National Voter Education Week. And I'll also shout out Marissa, who, while she was at the Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, served as one of the main creators of National Voter Education Week, and also we should also all of our steering committee partners for that. But especially going into the 2020 election, we saw this need to have really a civic holiday that's focused on voter education that really helps to bridge that gap between National Voter Registration Day and Election Day and actually casting the ballot. And I am excited to share that we've had dozens of election officials and secretaries of state from all across the country that have participated in National Voter Education Week, which falls that first week of October. So this year it will be October 2nd to the 6th. We have toolkits, we have graphics, we have a lot of information that folks can use. And we just really encourage election officials to, be spreading voter education broadly, but also participate in National Voter Education Week as a way to really share all of that information at a time when a lot of other organizations and companies and businesses and campuses are as well.
It's a great flag. Thank you. And Marissa, if you want to wrap us up on this one.
Sure. Yeah, I think the conversation around the websites is really important too, because sometimes election officials, like we have very limited maybe capacity sometimes in our website and like what, especially if it's connected to the county or the city, right? So I think another important point is that, and again, this is kind of, can tell that we're all passionate about this work and that there are certain best practices, but campuses maybe have a little bit more wiggle room sometimes. Again, it depends on the institution. And so they can create, and a lot of campuses have, where they're creating their own website. But instead of just making it and like that being it, they work with their local elections official to vet it and proof it and make sure it's correct. So it's a partnership. And I think that's really important as well. I did that when I worked at Rollins. I worked with the Orange County Supervisor of Elections office when we created ours to make sure all the information was correct. I know that the folks in Madison, Wisconsin are doing that. I know the folks in Boulder, Colorado are doing that with the campuses that they work closely with. So I think that's important too. So, yes, it would be great for all election officials, whether it's the Secretary of State's down to the local folks could have websites, but sometimes that's not possible. And again, students are already looking at the college website. So if you can kind of build off that active audience, you can like embed that information. Again, with the editing and proofing from your local elections officials. So I think that's another important piece as well for offices and folks that are doing this work to think through and consider as well.
Absolutely. I think you hit on it and it came up a few times, just utilizing these other folks in the community to amplify the trusted source info that's coming from the election official and the correct dates and all of that information. But then not everybody knows who their state or local election official is. And so some of those places where basically just meeting people where they're at, and as you said, they're at their college's homepage. Well, we're getting a little close on time, so I'm going to do one final question here that's just a little bit of a catch-all. Clarissa, we'll start with you, go back where we started in the beginning, and just wanted to give you a chance to talk about sort of what are some of the opportunities that you see for more effective partnerships and initiatives between student groups and or college administrators and election offices.
Yeah, well, I'll just quickly mention that in 2021, we partnered with the All In Challenge to survey about 100 campus administrators and 100 local election officials to learn more about what their partnerships do look like. And one thing that was really exciting out of that was we saw that about 70% already had some form of partnership, and an even higher number of those were really happy about the partnership that they did have and found a lot of value in it. And so I think really at the end of the day, we just encourage folks to start up those conversations that they haven't already about, just what the student voter experience looks like in their community. Because again, in many cases, as we've been saying, the goals of the campuses, the goals of student leaders, the goals of the election officials are really the same. And there's just so much opportunity there. And it's really just kind of identifying what are the unique needs and abilities of the different partners in your community.
Thank you for that. You were in that partnership on that survey. Jen, anything to add?
I was going to talk about the same thing, but I will just add, and that's totally great. I will just add that based on that, we came up with a little bit of a toolkit for some starting points, both for local election officials and especially for college administrators to reach out. And the other piece I'll just add is one of the things we've also been looking at collectively across the space is the proliferation of what we're calling nonpartisan student voter groups on campus. So they're often called things like Duke's vote or Pirates vote or DU votes or whatever, with either the campus name or the mascot ahead of them, but they are doing a lot of work on these campus coalitions and to share the word across with students. And so finding out also if your campus locally has one of those, and being able to really capitalize on a lot of the energy that the students are bringing to the space, I think can be really important. But I really just do want to underscore that so many of these partnerships already exist, and being able to use them, especially to underscore, which I know the folks in the space like Marissa are already doing, to underscore that changes each cycle. Because what happens is, because they're talking to their peers, they're hearing from the seniors that the voting worked this way last time, and then there's a change. There's a change in like where the place is, there's a change in the timeline, there's a change in what ID counts, right? And so making sure that that information gets out and during voter education week and earlier, and that the campus is aware of some of those pieces can be, just really critical. I also just want to add that, my organization, the All on Campus Democracy Challenge, Clarissa's organization, Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition, the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and so many others stand ready to help. So if there are other kinds of resources we can create, if there are folks on campuses we can introduce you to, if there are, things that we should be thinking about, like, please reach out, because we just want to help make this this whole system stronger and help all folks who are eligible be able to cast a vote successfully.
You heard it there, folks. Reach out. Yael, anything you'd add to that?
I love the call. I love the discussion, because we're talking about like leveraging the inherent resources at the institutions of higher education to support the election administrators. And similarly, I love the call that Jen had. It is to reach out. We would love to be able to report. For example, there are some places, I just was looking at a study in Pennsylvania that I was doing with the clinical students at Rutgers Law School. There are some places county by county where you see the implementation of best practices. But when you call a board of elections official in another part of the state, they say, oh no, we would never do that. But why not? Your peers are doing it within the state. So I think that sometimes there's a hesitation to change a status quo, to accept the status quo as stagnant, forever. But there are a ton of best practices that we would love to lift up that the local election officials are doing, and to support them either through our nonpartisan organizations or through our academic partnerships, or what have you, to really kind of study and lift up those best practices as a teaching instrument for other election officials, because there are some that are so wonderful, and there are others that are very interested in doing something, but they're not exactly sure how to do it, et cetera. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're happy to kind of assist and create those resources and tools, because if it's happening in one state or on one locality, it's also happening across the country. And there might be, for example, the Dropbox thing is one that comes to immediately comes to mind, or situating polling locations on campus. Some election officials do this, and they found huge success and it's a best practice for them, et cetera. And we would love to be able to tell those stories and to share it among your peers through resource communication, policy reports, et cetera.
That's great. Thank you. And Marissa, final word.
I feel like I have a lot of power with the final word. I think one of the other things that, having that initial individual connection to an institution, to a college or university, is super important. But for a lot of election officials, they're in a jurisdiction that has multiple schools. And so that can get cumbersome, because you're having to reach out. So like in Orange County, we formed a little coalition. And it was like a big state school, private liberal arts, community colleges, technical college. And we all met with the supervisor of elections office, just a phone call. We did it quarterly. And then as it got a little closer to the election, we did it maybe monthly, but I think it was bi-monthly. This is going back a few years, so I don't totally remember. But it made it a lot more manageable for our contact at the supervisor of elections, because instead of all of us calling with all these questions or reaching out, which we still did to some extent, but because we had this standing meeting, right, like things come up, it happens, but because we had the standing meeting, it reduced the amount of time we were reaching out to them, because we knew that we were all going to be in community together and get those questions answered. So, you know, and again, I know that, you know, maybe taking someone away from something else that they're working on, but if that can be managed, I do think having that set up can really help kind of, you know, as you get closer to an election and things start to get hectic and time is, you know, there's never enough time.
Great example. And again, not enough time for this conversation either. But so I just want to thank you all for joining this great conversation. It was fun to learn more about some of your efforts and recommendations. And thank you again for your work to help Americans vote.